So we do have some time for Q&A right now, and I have seen some questions pinging in from the audience. I have a question that I would love to ask you first as we kick off into the Q&A, if that's okay. Awesome. So first up, if you had to choose just one behavior trait in a trustworthy leader, what would it be and why?
It's a hard question. And the reason why is because context is so important when it comes to trust. So there are certain situations where competence is key, right? Like if they're not capable, if they don't have the knowledge and experience to do the job, then they can't keep us safe. They can't do that role. So in some situations that would lead. If I had to pick the trait that usually is the most important, that makes it very hard to trust someone if it doesn't exist, it's the trait of integrity. Because if you do not believe that person's intentions, if you do not believe everything they are trying to achieve is aligned with your best interests, whether that's their own self-serving ego, that they need to be a great leader, or whether it's the interests of their political party or their shareholders versus their employees, it's very hard to earn trust when integrity isn't there.
I think that's such an interesting reframe on integrity, because I think quite often people assume it's something about the other individual. Actually, you're talking about the alignment of interest, that I think you have integrity as the important part of that. So yeah, hugely interesting. I have a question here, and it's related to one of our Culture Ramp values. We actually reframed one of our values to trust people to own decisions. How do you think about the difference between trusting people just to make decisions as opposed to owning the decisions that they make?
It's a really key shift because, as I say, like I'm completely fascinated by language and you know, making decisions versus owning decisions. You've got two key things in there that have fundamentally changed: empowerment and accountability. So I've been into teams that they like to think they're high trust teams, and there's many positive things about their cultures. And they say, yeah, well, people can make decisions. I'm like, yeah, but once they've made the decision, you then control that decision. They have no follow through. And if they have no follow through and no ownership of that, then there is no satisfaction in the end result, right? You're sort of exerting that control and micromanagement after the decision is made. So this is really key, that deep trust is not just the autonomy to make decisions. It's so much of it is about letting go and giving that person, making that person feel really empowered to follow through on that decision, even if they may make a mistake somewhere along the way. It's not about abandoning them as well. So this can also happen where cultures, you know, the leaders are so removed from the decision making and they'll see it as empowerment, but people feel lost and they don't feel supported. So there is a very delicate balance between letting go and leaving people just to sink or swim.
Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. It's great if you can empower people, but if you're just trusting them to own decisions so that you don't have to, and I can pass the blame off, that's not trust anymore.
It's not true. It's actually not fair to them. Yeah. So, you know, and particularly when you're asking someone to step up or you're asking them to own a decision for the very first time, the type of support they need to have trust in themselves, right? Because when you're asking someone to trust themselves, essentially you're asking them to take a risk, to do something new or to do something differently. And they are swimming in that sea of uncertainty when you're asking them to take that kind of risk. So you have to make sure there's the support in place, because what we know is when people can't take that risk, when they can't take that leap into the unknown, what they do is they just retract back to the safe and the familiar.
Yes, I think that's such an interesting point. I'm just looking at a question from one of our audience members, which probably dovetails quite nicely with this. Karina Rook has said she really enjoyed the conversation, but it struck her that the link with the relationship with the unknown and that being a trigger for the stress response. Do you feel that there's a link between self-trust and resilience, as well as trust and organizational resilience? So that piece of moderating your own stress by trusting oneself.
It's such a great question. So first of all, like trusting oneself, this is another sort of thing that we need to rethink, that we need to challenge what we've been told. So this language of never doubt yourself, right? The self-help industry is full of it. Have full confidence, right? It's the very opposite of what trust in yourself really is. Trust in yourself is actually being able to sit with uncertainty, being able to sit in that space of doubt and being comfortable that you will find a way through. So this is a capability, again, that we need to develop, right? So one of the downsides of being in a culture and a society with instant information, with constant communication, is it creates cultures of false certainty. And therefore, like when we have to really sit with doubt and the unknown and the fact that we don't have the answer, it makes us incredibly anxious. It's the fear and flight response. So trust in yourself, developing that capability to be able to live with doubt, to be able to sit with the unknown, has almost like a magical halo effect on the organization. So it works both ways. It flows out from individual to team to culture, but we also see the other way is also true. So when you have a culture that is high trust, it seeps into the team, and then it gives the individual more confidence to have trust in themselves. So it's sort of a two-way flow.
Yeah, there's a few things that you've mentioned both in there and some of the earlier parts of the conversation that link to, I see it as sort of psychological safety. So we have questions within the surveys that we send around, even when I make a mistake, I still feel like I belong at the organization, for example, because those are the times when really, if you're trusted, you're going to get it wrong at some point, and you need people to back you up when you get it wrong. So what does that look like if you're trusted, but you mess things up? How should leaders respond to that in a sort of positive way?
Yeah, it's so much tied to sort of Amy Edmondson's brilliant work on psychological safety, but also tied to expectations. So, very often organizations will focus on the safety piece, but people still won't know what's expected of them. So if something does go wrong, what is expected of me is something really important to clarify. It can look like feedback. So cultures with a continual loop of feedback. So what you said in that meeting, the way you behaved, let's talk about that. But it's not sort of performance review. It's a culture of continual feedback that can create this feeling of safety that if you mess up or if you make a mistake, you're going to know where you went wrong. So that's a really good sort of technique and skill to embed inside of an organization to create this kind of safety. The other small thing, I always listen out for cultures of I versus cultures of we. So me versus we. So when people present, when they talk about the work that they're doing, is it I or we? We is one of the most subtle shifts to actually creating that safety, right? So even if you're working on something, it's we as a team that are responsible for that. So tuning into the language, the way people are talking about what they're up to, what the end goal is it a we-driven culture or a me-driven culture, can also be a really powerful signal.
That's really interesting, because I've also read quite a lot about attribution, whether when things go wrong, attribute it either to myself or externally. Actually, I didn't have enough preparation. The team were really busy, so they couldn't support me as much, is a much more helpful way sometimes of looking at it. Although I guess you can cross the boundary too far to everything's everyone else's fault. None of it's my fault.
It does tie to attribution. I mean, an example that's coming to mind is I was away on holiday last week and something didn't get done that should have got done. Now, I could get annoyed with that person, or I could actually say, now, what do we need to do differently when I'm out the office to make sure that doesn't happen again? And this is why it ties to the expectations. I wasn't clear about what was expected of that person and didn't hand over properly. Like there were many missing gaps. And it's in those gaps of assumptions, right? You assume that person knows what they're meant to be doing, or you assume that person knows how you're going to have their back. That's where trust breaks down on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think your point about feedback really sort of comes to the fore there. We often talk here at Culture Amp about separating the performance conversation from the development conversation. And just as you were saying, if you feel like you're going to be judged straight away, that your performance is at stake because you made one mistake. It's so different. It's a sort of different frame of mind compared to let's have a conversation around how that went and how we could do it differently next time. Like, it could have been a bit better in these areas.
Yeah, and feedback it's hard. I mean, I think we underestimate that it's a skill, and it makes many people uncomfortable. I'm someone that's continually asking for feedback, and what you have to tell people is, I'm not asking for praise. Like, I don't want you to say it was good or whatever, like, and what you realize is you have to be quite precise around what you're asking feedback around. So generalized feedback is really hard for people to give because they worry that you're going to receive it in a way that is personal. So in the same time, when you give someone feedback, really attaching it to something that they can understand is absolutely key.
Yes, totally. I was actually listening to something you were talking about recently with regards to like basically cultures in terms of how comfortable they are giving honest or tough feedback, as opposed to just kind of being nice to everybody. And I suppose there's an element of sort of fundamental trust in the organization that needs to be there before you can feel comfortable giving that tough feedback. So yeah, what would you say to that? How can organizations, where do they start with that? Is it about the organization or is it about the leader and the team?
Well, I always think organizations are made up of leaders and teams. So I have, a hard time sort of distinguishing those things. I don't think it's necessarily sort of a top-down thing. But when it comes to conflict, and this is also something that I've had to really challenge the way I think about it, because I struggle with conflict, I'm quite conflict averse. But going into organizations where they almost thrive on conflict, right? Like they have enough trust in place that friction and that disagreement can exist. And I was actually doing this interview recently with Ian Leslie, who wrote this brilliant book called Conflicted. And he describes conflict as information, that you learn more about people and more about an idea when there is conflict, versus is passive conversation. And so by not having conflict, you're missing out. To go back to your question, I think that comes from a leader. You really have to give people permission to disagree with you, to welcome it into your team. And for that, you do need trust, but it's a bit like vulnerability. It's a loop. So conflict and handling disagreement and coming through stronger as a team creates trust, but you need trust to actually enter that kind of state and process with people.
Yeah, constructive disagreement, totally. I think that could be a whole topic of its own. I've got a really fun question from the audience here. Who would you say is the most trusted person in the world?
Well, again, it's contextual, right? Like, so it's a really important question because it's the way we think about trust, right? When you look at trust surveys, which leader you trust, which company you trust, it's no offense to the person, it's not the right way to think about the question. I'd ask the question, who is the most trusted leader to do something? So I trust David Attenborough to teach me about the environment and climate change, but I don't necessarily trust him to negotiate Brexit. And then there's some leaders that sort of just have a feeling of trustworthiness around them. So I think Satya Nadella of Microsoft, for me, he's really sort of an illustration of the type of leadership we need right now, because he has that integrity and he also has that humility. He has these combination of things that even I don't know him and I don't know how well he does his job, he feels trustworthy sort of from a removed point of view. So there's certain leaders I trust to do certain things, and there are certain people that feel trustworthy.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, again, it comes back to some of the individual pieces. And we did have a question in the audience about the ability for one to trust other people could be moderated by our own personality. So some people tend to be more trusting. I think in the example that the audience member gave, they were talking about like big 5 measures. So whether you're agreeable or not, or how neurotic one is, might impact whether you're able to trust other people. What do you think to that? Because I think it does tie into this concept of actually trustworthiness comes from it's in the eyes of the beholder. rather than the individual subject.
It's such a, I mean, it goes back to this idea of building trust and being in control of that, and why we need to sort of rethink that assumption, because it is up to the giver, and sort of we call it someone's trust propensity. So someone's ability to take a risk and place their faith in another person, a thing, or an organization. Now, I sort of challenge the idea that some people have real trust issues, obviously, that have come from something deep within their childhood. But what you usually find is there's certain situations in your life where you find it easier to trust someone, to the point where you're almost apathetic. You don't even really think about that you're giving your trust to that person. And there's other situations where you find it incredibly difficult. And that's usually due to environment, past experience, or what's at stake. So those three things will influence how you're feeling about giving someone your trust. And you find that it crops up in strange situations. So I know Adam Grant's speaking next, and Adam and I know each other well, and he's very trustworthy and I trust him. But we were doing an interview together, and I don't know why, but something went slightly wrong, and he got really frustrated with me because he said, we've known each other long enough for you to trust me, and yet every question you're qualifying. Why haven't I earned your trust? And Adam really loses his cool. And I realized in that situation, it was a new dynamic for us. It was, for me, quite a high stakes situation, and I wasn't familiar with the environment. So I hadn't decided yet whether to give him his trust. It's not because he's not trustworthy. It was my decision as the giver. So it's very frustrating. That's what makes trust so fascinating and yet complex.
Yeah, that piece about the environment, and also, I guess also position is really important. Like, I can imagine if you go to the doctors and the doctor turns up in a white coat, you trust them because all the cues are saying, I should trust this person, they're wearing the right clothes. And I think you could look at the same thing in organizations where I should naturally trust the leader because they sound like they know what they're doing. So I should trust them because of the position that they're in.
I think that's shifting, though, to be honest. I think that's one of the biggest trust dynamics we see changing in culture and society is we call them these trust signals. So they are clues and symbols that we're knowingly or unknowingly use to decide whether that person is trustworthy. Now, I think a few things are happening. One, we're realizing maybe we've been over deferential to people in power, so that we shouldn't assume that we should trust them yet. And that also, this is an issue in terms of inclusion and diversity, that, if you're looking for these signals, and the signals that we look for are things that are familiar to us, what does that do or say for inclusion and diversity in terms of picking up on signals that make us uncomfortable, or picking up and trying to trust someone that has a very different belief system to us? So it's actually in that place of discomfort and this is what I mean by the gut feeling versus looking for information, that friction and that tension is absolutely key in terms of overcoming our biases and making better decisions about people.
That's such a fundamental point. I'm so glad you made that. Chris actually has asked a question along these lines around inclusion. So he said, as a Black person, it feels risky and scary to say, I don't know. Scary that others will see you as less capable or competent. What have you seen as the implications for trust for people of colour?
So I'm going to start by saying it's not my area of expertise, and it's something I want and need to learn more about. What I have been looking deeply into is the psychological biases that cause us to misplace our trust. So to either trust people that look and feel familiar to us, and hold our trust back from people that are not like us. And that could be for so many different reasons: race, gender, sexuality, political affiliation. And again, I think this is it feels uncomfortable, right? Because this is one of the things we haven't done well as organizations and cultures, is say, trust cannot be based on familiarity. If we are really serious around inclusion and diversity, everyone should feel safe to feel engaged, to feel trusted. If someone doesn't feel safe enough to say they don't know or they're not sure because of their race or their color, what kind of workplaces have we created? This should be one of our biggest goals, that within the next few years, we can get to a place that, regardless of who we are, that we see this as a strength, not a weakness. The reality is we are so far from that today. So I understand where that question is coming from, but it deeply upsets me that that's the kind of cultures and organizations that we've created and how far we've got to go.
Yes, absolutely. I'm with you. And it's something that we're really passionate about trying to change here at Culture Amp by getting the views of the employees and what they're actually experiencing and how does that experience differ based on who one is in the organization. Final question, because I know we're coming up to the end, but what role does proximity play in trust? Because obviously now we're all working separately. So just really interested in hearing some quick views on that before we finish up.
Do you mean physical proximity versus?
Yes. I mean physical proximity, but interested if there's other interpretations.
Yeah, so it's a really tricky question to answer quickly, but what we've actually seen, and the research is new, right? Because we've only got sort of 14 months of data, is actually the way we form trust in virtual environments can replicate the physical proximity. There are a couple of things that are hard to replicate in virtual environments. So the first being that consistency that we talk about, that experience that we have of people, and those small moments that are so key, those small moments that show people that you're engaged and you care. So how you replicate that virtually is really difficult. And the second piece is this conflict. So how you disagree, where you can't physically go up to that person and talk about it afterwards. We have a long way to go to replicating that in a virtual environment. So yes, trust is helped by proximity and physicality, because you can literally go up to that person and have a very different conversation and feeling with them.
Brilliant. I know I didn't give you just time to answer that question, so I apologize for that, Rachel. I just want to say at this point, we're just about to close up, and I just want to thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and your passion for the subject. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you for having me, and apologies for the sunlight again chopping off my head. So it was really
no problem.
Nice.
It's nice to have it.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.